Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today, we will hear part one of a special series that you'll hear more about here called Fire and Water, Extreme Weather Trends, and Community Infrastructure, the Basics. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box in your GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in that questions box, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. I will ask if your question is for a particular panelist, if you could state who you want to answer the question, that just helps me. So be sure to type those questions in. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we're sponsored by the Sustainable Communities Division. So we thank you and we welcome you and your series, again, that you'll hear more about here shortly. So thank you for joining us. Coming up next on your screen are our remaining sessions for September. So you can register for these and all of our upcoming sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And we're booked through the end of the year, and we're booking alternate days now. So be sure to check back frequently, as once I get information, I can get registration going, we post them up. To log your CM credits for attending today's session, just head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage. And this session will also be available on demand through the end of this year, and then also for 2022. Again, you will learn more. This will take care of a special new credit that you are going to be required to log. So again, it's available here live and then on demand through next year. Be sure and like us on Facebook if you're on social media. That's where I post any important date or time changes. I also post when we have new sessions available for you to register for. So head over there and just search Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. And we record all of our sessions and we post them on our YouTube channel. So be sure to head over there and subscribe to our channel, and you'll get updated when I post a new session. And we have well over 350 sessions available for you to peruse for free. Please subscribe. I think that's the end of my housekeeping items. Again, type your questions in that questions box, and we will get to those at the end of the Q&A. And make sure you stay alert, because we also have a couple polling questions coming up, and we'll let you know when that happens. So for now, I am going to turn it over to Carla to kick things off and to explain this cool series and to get things started. So Carla.
Hi, I'm Carla Ebenbach, and welcome to the kickoff event of the Sustainability and Resilience series. This series was created to provide learning opportunities for planning professionals on these two important subjects or concepts. They have risen to the fore in many aspects of our work, and we all need to better understand them in order to respond effectively to the multi-layered challenges arising in communities. So, next slide. So maybe some definitions would be helpful. Get to that one, okay. Planning for sustainability means balancing social, economic, and environmental resources, incorporating resilience, and linking local actions to regional and global concerns. Meanwhile, planning for resilience means supporting the capacity of individuals, communities, and systems to thrive, survive, and adapt in the face of chronic stresses and acute shocks, and even transform when conditions require it. Next. So the S&R series, as we call it, will offer diverse perspectives under this wide subject matter umbrella over roughly 2 years, exploring 12 topics and at 2 levels of instruction for those new to the subject matter and for those more familiar and experienced, resulting in hopefully 24 events by 2024. You'll be able to earn AICP CM credit, as Christine said, for either the live or the on-demand version of any series session. The recordings will become a library of resources available at no charge. And moreover, attending sessions after January 2022 will earn you the new mandatory SNR CM credit. So not for today's webinar, but you still get the regular AICP credit for today. And a word more about that new upcoming credit. Along with equity, sustainability and resilience will be a new CM requirement for AICP planners as of January, as per the AICP Commission. After the new year begins, any live or on-demand series session that you attend can earn it, but there will likely be plenty of other sources outside the series for earning the credit too. This series is actually an outgrowth of the development of that credit. I chaired the task force that developed its criteria, and in the process, we discovered a real need for more learning opportunities like this. Volunteers came out from a whole host of APA divisions. I'm here representing the Sustainable Communities Division, for example, to guide the series with all of their various expertise. So anybody interested in joining our group or in being a speaker on a future webinar, we're seeking planners as well as many other types of professionals. Please reach out and I'll be happy to discuss with you. Future sessions will get into such topics as climate science, public health, economic strategies, climate mitigation strategies, policy tools, preparedness for shocks and stresses, among others, all as related to sustainability and or resilience, and all sessions addressing equity implications of the topic, policies, or case studies at hand. So on to the program. Our moderator today is Jim Schwab, FAICP. For many, he needs no introduction. Jim is an independent planning consultant based in Chicago and chair of the APA Hazard Mitigation and Disaster Recovery Planning Division. He also managed APA's Hazards Planning Center. Next, Jim will introduce today's subject and our speakers. Jim, it's over to you.
I think you're muted.
I apologize. We have 2 speakers today. Edith Hannigan is the Land Use Planning Program Manager at the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, which is the regulatory arm of CAL FIRE. She has worked in fire hazard planning and emergency management for 10 years and received her Master of Planning degree in Sustainability Planning from the University of Southern California. So welcome, Edith. And second will be Chad Burgins. In 2011, Chad joined the staff of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. Since 1993, his work is focused on floodplain management, hazard mitigation, land use planning at the state, local, and private sector levels. Chad is a recognized national expert in floodplain management and hazard mitigation. He's participated in numerous national research groups, such as the National Academies of Science, panels, General Accountability Office interviews, presented congressional testimony, and provided input to local, state, national, and international governments. Chad has a Bachelor of Science in Natural Resources from Ohio State University. So we are going to turn over the controls to Edith Hannigan, and she will take it from here.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to say good morning and then remembered I'm on Pacific time. Let me see, here we go. So we first have a poll question for you to learn a little bit more about your experience with wildfire hazard planning. Christine, are you administering the poll, or is there something that I have to do?
Nope, I am launching it as we speak.
Fabulous.
Okay. So we just want to know.
Curious how.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think we were going to say the same thing. We just want to know how you'd rate your current level of understanding with wildfire planning concepts that address the wildland-urban interface, just to get a sense of who we have on the call with us today. Oh, wow. Okay. So we have not a lot of people here familiar with these kinds of planning concepts. So I'm really excited to be here with you today and talk to you a little bit about how we can plan for wildfire hazards. I'm trying to move to the next slide, but I'm not sure it's working very well. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So like Jim said, my name is Edith Hannigan. I work for the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. You may be more familiar with the agency known as CAL FIRE, the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. I work for a 9-member board appointed by the governor that sets policy and regulatory direction for CAL FIRE. And I'm here to talk to you today about wildfires and the built environment. Oops, too far. Okay, so these slides are a little bit difficult, or these graphs are a little bit difficult to see, but the first thing to understand, of course, is that in virtually every aspect, wildfires are increasing in America. The pure number of wildfires is increasing. These wildfires are burning more land, and the cost to fight these fires is rising. One of the reasons why, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, one of the reasons why the cost to fighting these wildfires is rising is because of the incursion of human development into the wildlands. When firefighting resources are tasked to protect homes and structures instead of perhaps managing the fire for healthy ecological values, the cost to fight these fires starts rising. And in addition to all of this, a big driver of these increasing wildfire statistics, of course, is climate change. Particularly in the western United States, temperatures are rising, our warm seasons are lasting for longer, our snow is melting sooner. Frequently our winters are getting warmer, so our snow, when we would have normally gotten snow, we're getting rain, so we're losing that snowpack that then melts and provides water for us during the summer. And so our forests are staying drier for longer throughout the year, so they're becoming more susceptible to these wildfires. And you can see in the graph on the right-hand side there, in light blue is the anticipated number of wildfires without climate change, and the dark blue on top shows that increase of wildfires that we're seeing because climate change is making everything hotter and drier for longer. So the first thing, one of the first things we should talk about is what is the wildland-urban interface? The wildland-urban interface is the area where human development, homes, other structures, industrial, commercial development, either starts entering into or abuts the wildland. So sometimes you might see a more intermixed community where there's low density rural development that's scattered within a forested environment, or another kind of vegetation, or you might see ones where a community directly abuts a big area of wildfires, or I'm sorry, a big area of vegetation. So that could be a community across the street from some kind of park. In California, we have a lot of folks who live directly adjacent to national forest lands. Those areas where the built environment intermixes, intermingles, the wildlands is what's called the wildland-urban interface. And that wildland-urban interface is actually the fastest growing land use type in America, based on the number of, because we're building more homes inside the wildland urban interface, the wildlands aren't encroaching onto our built environment. So these charts are just some data about the rapid growth of the WUI from 1990 to 2010. In absolute numbers, both the geographic scope of the area, the number of houses, the number of people in the WUI have all been increasing. And the proportion of people in each state living in the wildland urban interface has been increasing as well. And you can see that really clearly in these, I guess, 9 images. These are showing different ways of calculating the number of people in the WUI. So this is as a percentage change in the state total, the change in WUI percentage itself, and the growth rate of the WUI. And as you can see, except for, I guess, the far northern plains, North Dakota, South Dakota, there's really no part of the United States that hasn't seen some kind of increase in the wildland urban interface. Only the District of Columbia had an absolute negative growth of communities in the WUI. So this is not just a California issue. This isn't just a Western United States issue. It's truly an issue in the South and the Southwest, in the Northeast, in the Plain States. While everybody here has a reason for planning for and learning more and incorporating wildfire hazard planning into your planning processes. And the risk, so with the growth of the WUI, our wildfire risk changes. So WUI growth means that we have more wildfire ignitions. The greatest drivers of fire ignitions are human caused. So many wildfires, for example, start on the side of a roadway where somebody is dragging a chain that sparks and lights roadside vegetation on fire, or they've pulled over and they leave to go on their way. And again, sparking or the heat lights the vegetation on the side of the road. Of course, in California, we're very well aware of the dangers that power lines and utility infrastructure, the risk that causes for wildfire starts. So when we see this increasing growth of humans into the wildlands, we also see an increase in these human-caused ignitions. And then this growth also puts more lives and more property at risk as well. As, of course, you grow into the wildlands, that's just increasing the number of people who are at risk from wildfires. And the presence of the wildland urban interface also changes firefighting tactics and priorities. So in many ecosystems across the United States, wildfire is actually a really critical component of ecological health. There's a lot of different types of plants that rely on wildfire for regeneration and regrowth. A lot of species rely on a low severity wildfire to come and clear out underbrush so that different types of plant species can thrive and not get choked out by overgrowth. And other species have become fire adapted. They don't necessarily require fire to, for example, release their seeds, but they have become naturally adapted to survive a wildfire and even use a wildfire to thrive in certain instances. But the presence of so there are reasons for allowing a wildfire to burn naturally through a forested community or another ecological community that relies on wildfire. Grass fires are a great example. So there's a lot of great reasons to allow a wildfire to burn through those areas. But if those fires are getting to communities, are encroaching on the built environment, typically, the public expects that firefighters are going to go in and are going to protect their communities. And so it becomes imperative for firefighting agencies to stop this wildfire that for the forest might be a very ecologically healthy thing to have happen, but it's putting lives and property at risk. So they have to slow down or stop the wildfire before it gets to those communities. So the presence of the wildland urban interface changes those firefighting tactics and changes the firefighting priorities in ways that are not necessarily the most ecologically healthy for, and that perhaps leave behind a vegetated, wildland environment that continues to be prone to high severity wildfires. And of course, it's always important to remember that this wildfire risk, while it's shifting because of the growth of the WUI, the burden of that risk is also, of course, it's not falling equitably among folks. There's opportunities to build more safely. There's opportunities to retrofit homes so that, you don't have a wood shake roof, for example, or that you have double pane windows, things that we know help a structure survive a wildfire. But those types of mitigations are really difficult for folks who are low income, folks who are renting. They don't necessarily have the capital to invest in these upgrades to their home. And then, of course, if a wildfire does come and it does destroy homes, rebuilding can be very inequitable as well. When you're thinking about, a large number of folks are un or underinsured, especially in some of our rural environments. In California, we've seen a lot of retirees living on fixed incomes who have owned their home for 30 or 40 years. They don't have insurance. And then, of course, renters are in a difficult position as well. And so rebuilding after a wildfire can end up exacerbating inequalities as well. So what can planners do about this? I have to fully admit, I got into fire hazard planning after I went to a presentation at an APA conference because I had no idea that planners could actually do something to stop a wildfire or that we could do something to build our communities to resist wildfires. So the first thing that planners should know is how do homes and structures burn in a wildfire? And there's 3 graphics here from a new publication from the University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources Extension about defensible space around homes that have these really great images of how homes burn in a wildfire. So they can burn from embers that come from a fire front. In California, we've seen a lot of wind-driven wildfires. So a lot of times a community might burn not because the flaming front of the wildfire came through, but because embers that were being created by the fire were blown a mile or a mile and a half ahead of the wildfire and lighting these different communities on fires. We've seen that in a lot of different fires here. So embers are one way that a structure can catch on fire. Of course, the flaming front, if the wildfire can actually, if the fire itself meets these structures, that's another way. And then radiant heat. If there is vegetation nearby, if there's a tree on the property that's caught on fire and it's near enough to the structure, it can break the glass in windows. It can start melting vinyl siding, things like that, and then can catch the house can burn down that way. So that's the first thing to understand for planners about what we can do to prevent wildfire losses. And it's important for us to know, too, that both new and existing development can be protected. So I talked a slide ago about mitigating existing homes, but we also can do things like require defensible space around structures, which is where you reduce the amount of vegetation immediately around a home to prevent fire going from a bush or a tree on the property directly to the home. We can also the structure hardening that I mentioned, doing things like enclosing eaves, putting mesh screens behind vents, double pane windows, and then, of course, building more smartly, smart growth. Where are we putting people? If we're putting people in an area of risk, what are we doing to minimize that risk? If we're putting people, what can we do to incentivize development in areas that have lower risk? So those are all, and of course, all of those things we'll talk about more next week in our presentation, but those are just some ideas for what you can do to start thinking about how to reduce your wildfire risk. And then there's a lot of really incredible resources out there for folks. The National Fire Protection Administration, or maybe it's Association, National Fire Protection Association has a program called FireWise, which is a grassroots community level program to encourage folks to take responsibility for their fire protection and create and this is primarily for existing communities. That's a really great resource if you have existing communities at fire risk. Fire adapted communities is another really great one. Your state forestry association or university extensions have great publications about landscaping to reduce fire.
This is Officer Sarah Schultz calling you from the legal department. The very second you receive this message, you need to leave your work aside so that we can discuss about your case and take necessary action on this matter. In order to connect with federal agent, press 1 and you will be connected to the concerned department. If we don't hear from you, then we will be forced to take legal action against you. Press 1 and you will be connected to the concerned department.
The conclusion of my section, we'll go into all of the things on my last slide more next week when we talk about some more the actual specifics of how you integrate fire hazard planning into the rest of your planning processes. So thank you so much for attending today, and I hope I was able to give you an introduction to the wildfire hazard planning.
Okay, thank you, Edith, and we will now turn over the controls to Chad and take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, and I am just trying to accept the controls. That's the last thing I need to do. Jim, I'm having a little bit of trouble accepting the controls. Is it possible you could just do that for me? And I apologize. I'm not seeing the notice that would normally come up.
You just did
Chad,
that.
this is Edith.
Yes, Edith.
I didn't get a notice to pop up. I found that the best way to flip through the sides is to use the arrow keys on your keyboard rather than the mouse.
Okay, let me see if that works. Okay.
Slides.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a bit of a lag. Okay, there we go. All right. Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Chad Burgins, and I'm Executive Director of the Association of State Floodplain Managers. And I want to talk a little bit today about extreme weather trends and community infrastructure from the perspective of flooding itself. ASFPM is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing flood losses in the nation, as well as identifying and respecting the natural functions of floodplains. We have floodplains in the country as a physical feature on our landscape because they are areas that are subject to flooding, and there's lots of natural benefits there. And yet, over time, as a society, we've chosen, I think, to ignore those and instead perhaps have uses and actions that run kind of contrary to that. So I kind of thought I'd start off with something a little bit funny. In terms of the flood world, we need some of these jokes sometimes to keep us going here. But the reality is, Houston, we do have a problem. And in fact, it was in Houston back in 2018 where Hurricane Harvey and its 51 inches of rain over 5 days set the record for the largest amount of rainfall from a single storm event anywhere in the continental United States. Now, why I also like this graphic is because this also shows Harvey during, or the Texas Medical Center, which is the world's largest medical campus during Harvey, and basically previously received several $billion in damages during Tropical Storm Allison. I believe that was around 2001. And in the really in the 2 decades since, have been doing various forms of mitigations to render it largely flood-proofed when the United States record for rainfall happened in its backyard. So really what this is a portrayal of is the end state or the end result of what we are capable of doing in terms of protecting our businesses, protecting our homes, and especially protecting our infrastructure when we put our minds to it. But again, the focus of today's presentation is to kind of give you the basics. It's going to talk about the problem of these extreme weather events, a few trends that we're seeing, a little bit about infrastructure, and then next week we'll actually go into more specific techniques and resources to do that. But think about this, Harvey was in 2018, but just this summer, and in fact, I believe about a month ago or so, in McEwen, Tennessee, we had 17 inches of rain from what was a summer thunderstorm complex that resulted in beating the state's 24-hour record of rainfall of 13.6 inches. And then, of course, we had just on the heels after that the remnants of Hurricane Ida, and I'm always I always like the idea of remnants because it almost implies by its name that they aren't maybe particularly very hazardous. Yet it's the remnants of storms that often can cause that unexpected significant hazard event. And in the case of the Northeast United States, the remnants of Ida certainly wreaked a lot of havoc and resulted in setting New York City's 1-hour rainfall record of 3.15 inches and a daily record in Newark, New Jersey of 8.4 inches of rainfall, which was the wettest day since they've been keeping records, I think, since the 1930s. And then just for fun, when I was at the gym 2 days ago, I was listening to Al Roker on the Today Show. And one of the things that he said that I think is particularly germane to this presentation was that 5 of the 6 last landfalling hurricanes in the continental United States experienced this phenomena of what we call rapid intensification. And so we'll kind of put that into context in a moment. But first, in terms of trends in flood damages in the nation, there's of course a lot of different ways that we can track this, but a couple of different ways are interesting. One of those is that we tend to track what now are called the billion-dollar flood events, and we've seen a lot of those, especially in the 20-teens of those events, and also here in the 2020s. But when you look even at a longer period of time, from the 1980s to the 90s to 2000s to 2010s, but from the 1990s, if we were averaging roughly around $5.5 billion a year in flood damages, that nearly doubled in the 2000s to $10 billion a year in flood damages, and that then doubled again to almost $20 billion a year in flood damages in the 20-teens. Now, are we going to go with that trend of doubling yet again in the 2020s? And just as a point of reference, at least for Hurricane Ida, which both had flood and wind damages, but it looks like the low ends of the estimates now of that one storm event could be upwards of $40 billion. And that would rank that in the top 10 of the costliest storms to ever hit the United States. But, as planners, right, we're thinking about the future. We're thinking about future development and growth and where that goes and how we handle it. And so, so back several years ago, the ASFPM Foundation had a presentation by by Arthur Nelson, a demographer from Virginia Tech. And although for those of you that are keeping up on demographics, these numbers are likely are lower based on more current census information in terms of the number of population in the U.S. By 2050, the overall point, I think, is still valid. And so again, even if you scaled this down, think about the number of new, for instance, housing units that have either been built in the 2000s or will be built up until between now and 2050. And even more so, the amount of non-residential space, so our commercial properties, our industrial properties, the fact that that probably 225% of the space will not have existed in 2000 that will exist by 2050. And then also we think about things like the lifespan. Now with residential or with commercial properties, that lifespan is quite a bit shorter. But when we think about homes, we do have an ethic in this country of preservation. And in fact, the average lifespan of homes is something that northward even of over 150 years on average. So when you think about that and you think that homes and businesses are all connected to infrastructure. They need infrastructure to get there. What does this mean for infrastructure and the infrastructure needs in our country? So a couple trends for you to maybe be aware of in terms of extreme weather, and again, and in particular flooding that way that we're seeing that has an impact on our built environment. One of those is this notion of stationarity. Now, what do I mean by stationarity is dead? Well, stationarity is kind of this concept that the weather largely remains static or the same over time. And in fact, we went through a period from about the 2040s or so to the 2080s where that indeed was the case. But then beginning in the 2080s into the 2090s and then accelerating up until present time, the basically non-stationarity became the main driver. And non-stationarity is really this notion that the weather is changing and it's changing over time. And so one of the things that we know from the scientific evidence is that extreme precipitation events are increasing. And very simply put, warmer air equals heavier rain. Okay. Secondly, warmer oceans equals basically jet fuel for hurricanes. And what does that mean? Well, they could be larger, they could be more destructive, they could have higher winds, they could have higher storm surges, and they can go through this phenomena that Al Roker talked about 2 days ago, which is rapid intensification. That is, in that last, in a short period of time, like 24 hours, it might jump from a category 1 to a category 3 or 4, from a minor hurricane to a major. And then thirdly is really this phenomena of urban stormwater flooding is worsening. And that in particular has some pretty profound impacts and implications, especially as it applies to equity. One of the more recent activities I'd had the honor of being involved in was being on a National Academies of Science panel that ended up coming up with the report framing the challenge of urban flooding in the United States, and you see a caption of that there. And basically to do that study, the committee, we conducted 4 workshops in metropolitan areas to get an understanding of the causes and impacts of urban flooding, and really to try to identify it in terms of kind of 3 tasks: identifying commonalities and differences among case studies, looking at the size of importance of urban flooding, and the causes of actions of urban flooding to existing resources and policies. And a couple of findings that really emerged out of that is that first of all, metropolitan areas have a unique flood hazard and manages urban flooding in its own unique way, and it uses a tailored mix of federal, state, local, and non-governmental financial and informational resources. Okay. Secondly, each metropolitan area, the impacts of flooding are particularly felt by disenfranchised populations. And there are numerous reasons for that, and numerous historical as well as contemporary reasons for that. And then thirdly, all 4 dimensions, whether you look at physical, social, and informational, and those kinds of things, and actions and decision making are needed to understand and managing urban flooding. But one of the other things that we really found, I think, and this is one that I think is both revelationary, but also cautionary, and that is greater investments are needed in research to understand and develop interventions to mitigate the social impacts of urban flooding and their disparate effects across populations. And in fact, what we found is that while we saw definitely anecdotal evidence of significant inequities in urban flooding areas, and they varied depending on the metro area we went to. At the same time, we've not had a whole lot of rigorous academic study when it comes to the social dimensions, and we need far more research on that. But I think it's safe to say that the urban flooding phenomena, because what we found over time, and we have numerous studies that identify this, is that in as much as we have a disproportionate number of disadvantaged populations in flood hazard areas, urban flooding worsening means the impacts also get worse on those populations. So as I mentioned earlier, again, this is some data from NOAA that looks at the extreme one-day precipitation events in the contiguous 48 states. And again, what you tend to see is the rising trend line starting around 1970 and really going through about 2020. Now it looks like there's a bit of a tailing off that happens every so many years, and so the expectation is, and what seems like we're seeing again as that continued to rise. And again, this is another fairly well-known graphic when it comes to very heavy change, very heavy precipitation events. And these were based on some data from the previous IPCC climate change report. But I think what's noteworthy here is that every area of the United States is experiencing this percentage change in heavy precipitation. And that includes areas where maybe the overall precipitation actually decreases. Even in areas that get drier, that rainfall distribution is happening in more intense and briefer episodes, as opposed to being more distributed. And again, from a flooding standpoint, that is of particular concern because, of course, then that generates more excessive runoff. So in terms of impacts on infrastructure, and as planners, when you think of infrastructure, you're probably familiar with all of these different categories. But I think the important thing to be aware of is that the impact of flooding can be very different on your different infrastructure systems. And yet, at the same time, you need to look at all of that infrastructure to see if there is indeed a flooding impact that you need to, that either there needs to be awareness of in your community or that eventually needs to be addressed. So for instance, on roads and bridges, it could be for anything from simple road overtopping causing hazardous conditions to drivers, to bridges or culverts being undersized. And so when a flood actually happens, that undersized condition causes water to back up until at some point it explosively breaks through, that typically will damage or destroy the culvert or the bridge. It also could mean things like stormwater drainage. The fact is, our stormwater drainage systems really got rolling in the 1970s, and it came along kind of commensurate with the passage of the Clean Water Act. The focus tended to be a lot more for water quality versus quantity. And it's really just been in the last couple decades that we begin to designing, I think, stormwater much more for water quantity, especially extreme events like flooding in our communities. I've always said that, and from the standpoint of water and wastewater plant, if you want to have the highest dollar impact of a flooding event, usually look at your water or wastewater treatment plants. It seems like every time a flood happens at a wastewater treatment plant, you're talking of hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages. So of course, when you think about it, hopefully if you're at the point of siting new facilities, you can just site it totally out of flood hazard areas. But if not, at least doing component by component evaluations and thinking about flood proofing. Dams and levees, yes, they are infrastructure that helps reduce flooding, but as infrastructure themselves, they need to be made more resilient. So that, for instance, if you have a levee that is designed to a certain level and it overtops, Are you going to get more of a controlled overtopping that you know what the outcomes are going to be, or are you going to get a catastrophic failure of that levee, which can and has and will continue to happen? A lot of times when you look at even when you look at state laws, when it comes to schools and public buildings, what you typically find is that those tend to be exempt from some state codes and standards and those kinds of things as well. Yet again, those are part of our infrastructure, and certainly when those are impacted, they come at not only a great monetary cost, but a great social cost, especially with schools that are unable to reopen. And so need to think about that. And then finally, there's infrastructure and there's infrastructure, right? Critical infrastructure is more defined as the infrastructure that if it goes down during a hazard event, it itself will create a more hazardous condition. And so we need to have even better standards for critical infrastructure when it comes to flooding that exceed the standards that we might just have for plain old infrastructure. So again, from the standpoint of what planners can do, and we'll go into more details and give some more specific examples and resources and those kinds of things during next week's presentation. But in terms of kind of looking at some of the bigger buckets, planning and zoning. And one of the take-home messages, and again, I formerly had been a county planner as well as a county floodplain manager. And while there's always an emphasis on building codes, in my opinion, land use is as much or probably far more important than codes for sustainable flood risk management. Because things like zoning, things like subdivision controls are going to allow you to initially say, hey, is this an appropriate use for a flood hazard area? And should we have that use located in somewhere maybe more safely? That being said, codes and standards are important. But codes and standards do not do a great job of dealing with infrastructure themselves. And we need, many of you may have heard of the National Flood Insurance Program. That's kind of the basic set of standards that over 22,000 communities in the United States have adopted. But those standards are also widely recognized as minimum, and they're 40 years old. We've learned a lot since that time in terms of better floodplain management standards. Flood hazard mitigation. This is kind of the set of techniques and approaches and even local plans that you have to address the existing at-risk environment. And so we need strategies for that. Warning systems are going to help us in areas that are flood prone, that we have development, and that development is going to continue to be there to help warn of those hazards so that we don't have things like the very tragic deaths that we had in the New York, New Jersey area, where you had, for instance, things like, folks in basements being drowned from flooding, or people driving into flooded roadways that they weren't aware of. And then finally, public information. I think planners have a tremendous responsibility to do as much education as they can to the public in their jurisdictions. And so, how can planners do better with informing the public on not only flood hazards that maybe FEMA's identified on their maps, but all the flood hazards that are there, urban flooding hazards, flood hazards that are a result of failures of dams or levees, and even hazards like tsunami, coastal storm surge, and those kinds of things. So again, I wanted to thank you for at least giving me a little bit of time to share just some thoughts in terms of those extreme weather trends, and also, just giving some introductory thoughts on, those extreme weather, flooding, and on infrastructure. So Jim, I think I'll turn it back to you.
Great. I think we're actually going to jump into a little bit of Q&A now. So if my panelists wouldn't mind turning your webcams back on so we can see you, we have a few minutes to go through some questions. Wonderful. Welcome back. First question here. Can the panelists address the links between wildfire and flooding debris flow? Will future webinars talk about an all hazards approach? So I don't know if that's part of your plan for your series, but let's take that first part first, addressing wildfire and flooding debris flow.
Sure. Yeah. So I wasn't thinking about it as part of my presentation, but I'll take a note and include that. I love an all hazards approach, so I'm thrilled with that question. Thinking frequently, following wildfire, when you have denuded hillsides, you've lost vegetation that would normally hold in soil, and then you get winter rains, you do end up frequently with debris flows or mud flows. We saw this in Montecito after the Thomas fire in 2017. We've seen it after other wildfires. That's a really important reason why maintaining the health of our forests and the health of our fire adapted ecosystems is really important. The thing with wildfire planning, it's not just about how are we building our communities to be more resilient, but also how are we managing our open space, so that the open space itself is resilient to wildfires, and that if a fire does come through with the type of fire that's healthy for the environment and isn't going to result in a high severity fire that really turns the soil hydrophobic, that gets rid of all of the vegetation that was holding the soil down. So when you're coming at this from a planning perspective, it's not just what are we doing about our built environment, but also what are we doing to support our natural environment and a healthy fire regime there.
Yeah, and Edith really went into, I think, some of the basic principles there. And in fact, sometimes in the flood management world, we say there are two sides of the same coin when it comes to hazard and risk. In areas that are subject both to wildfires and flooding, you need to plan and mitigate for both of those hazards. And one of the places that you can do that is in your community's hazard mitigation plan. One of the things that I have a newfound respect for when I was in the consulting world and worked on a state mitigation plan over in Idaho, I got to learn a lot more about wildfire risk and the whole science of wildfire. And it's really, one of the things that's important is it's its own discipline. There's a lot of very specific detail and things. Same with flood. Yet we can identify and tease out some very common techniques to mitigate against the hazards, and especially where you have wildfire followed by flood. And so would encourage everybody, if your local mitigation plans have, number 1 and 2 hazards are flood and wildfire or vice versa, then it absolutely needs to have actions and be thoughtful about those techniques that you can use to mitigate that flooding risk and that debris flow risk after a wildfire.
Thank you. Next question. Can we dive a little bit into the idea of dams and levees? The person asking the question is saying, isn't establishing dams and levees humans kind of controlling nature? Are there ways in which we could do without disrupting nature's boundaries and putting in dams and levees? Are there alternatives? Is there a fine line between when you should just say, you know what, we're not going to build over here, period, versus, you know what, it's okay, it's ecologically okay that we put a dam here or a levee here? Where's that line at?
Sure. So first of all, in full disclosure, when you look at ASFPM's mission, we tend to be very partial to what we call non-structural flood techniques, mitigation techniques. And when we say non-structural, it means not the large flood control structure. So definitely our preference is more of that you can mitigate building by building or mitigate your infrastructure, and you don't need the dams and levees, because I think, as the person writing the question points out, there are impacts to those. And the other thing too is that dams and levees are engineered for a specific protection level. And if you go back to the concept that I identified earlier, non-stationarity, that means over time, if non-stationarity is resulting in higher flood risks, that means that protection level at some point is going to be exceeded. I think the question kind of answered itself a little bit, is that yes, in many cases, there are alternatives to building new dams and levees. That being said, there are appropriate places for dams and levees, and especially if you have maybe some high-risk concentrated areas that it's just not feasible to individually elevate the buildings or those kinds of things. And I'm kind of thinking about, around New York City, they're incorporating this berm concept of a large kind of flood controlled structure around things like Lower Manhattan. That's going to be a feasible option. The other aspects of dams and levees, though, that I think is probably far more ubiquitous, but people aren't planning for, and that's the hazards in case of overtopping or failure. And part of that is because after 9/11, there was kind of a knee-jerk reaction to say, hey, we don't want that inundation information out there widely because some terrorists might get it and blow up a dam and cause destruction. And so planners and community officials don't have a lot of access sometimes to that data. For most all states, I think all except one, have dam safety programs. They have levee programs that have data on inundation areas below dams and levees. And I would urge planners to not only have that, but have that and make that available. We're pushing at the federal level, federal agencies, to make that public. We think it's in the public interest. The Corps of Engineers has been really one of the bold leaders in this area recently, and they're going to be putting that information out beginning, I believe, next year more publicly. So that's an aspect that we need to think about too.
Great. Oh, I love questions like this. Collaboration. So can you all speak to engaging with transportation planning and emergency management? Any partnerships that you've observed to be particularly helpful?
I'd love to speak to this. I love good collaboration.
Right?
So one thing that we've done in California is we have some very specific requirements for general plans when it comes to reducing what we call the unreasonable risk of wildfire to your community. But many of those often sort of find themselves in a Venn diagram with things that are required in a local hazard mitigation plan. And so at CAL FIRE, we partnered with our state Office of Emergency Services so that when we go out and we talk to a community about the wildfire requirements for their safety element, we're there with OES who are talking about how to integrate that with what they're doing for their LHMP. And so now we have safety elements and LHMPs that are coordinated with each other and that have complementary goals and plans. They're used the same risk assessment. A lot of people think that, we're doing the general plan, we have to do a risk assessment. But that risk assessment is already done in the LHMP, or perhaps they're going to update the LHMP, but they've done the risk assessment in their safety element. So we've partnered with Cal OES so that when we're working with local jurisdictions, we can really make sure that the work that they're doing on these different plans and across their own local agencies isn't happening in a vacuum. And we've seen a marked increase in improvement in the safety element and the really strengthening mitigation measures and goals and plans and policy objectives for wildfire, and the same in the local hazard mitigation plan. So it's really important. I think I describe my job a lot of time as translating firefighter to planner and planner to firefighter. And I think it's really important that planners are in the room when the LHMP is being updated, and vice versa. I think it's really important for OES to be in the room when the safety element, or what we call the safety element, but when the general plan is being updated.
Yeah. I actually remember when I was a brand new county planner and floodplain manager, the county didn't have space for me, and I shared an office with our county emergency management director, who was also new. And one of the things that always struck me about that time is we got to talking and learn about what each other does respectively, and ended up having a really great partnership, from that time on. And I say that anecdote actually because it's been my experience in working with hazards in almost 3 decades that at the local, at the state, at the federal level, silos exist. And so it literally can be as easy as just going out and having that conversation with your emergency managers, or with your county or local roads folks, your state DOT, that kind of thing, and start beginning sharing information, start having committees and getting them involved in groups, and so that you're doing the collaboration, and so that they're aware of all the flood hazards that you're aware of. Because again, if you're also have that role of floodplain manager, you probably have a lot of data that maybe some of the other agencies don't have, and they in turn, might invite you. Emergency managers often, deal with response plans. They're going to deal with more with warning systems and things. Again, there's just huge areas of potential collaboration, but sometimes it's just sitting down and making the time, intentionally making the time for those conversations to happen.
Thanks. And this is an interesting question. Any case studies for mitigating hazards on military installations? What you got?
I do not have any,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Is that top secret or
I could
classified?
try to find some.
Right?
Actually, the only recent work that I'm aware of, it's not really a case study. A couple years ago, I know the Union of Concerned Scientists published a report that looked at kind of flood risk for military installations, but it didn't focus on the mitigation side of that. That being said, we've had some pretty high-profile military bases be impacted by significant flooding and hurricane events. I think, and I'm trying to think, it was the Air Force Base down in, I believe, the Florida Panhandle. Maybe it was MacDill. A couple years ago, that just got annihilated by that hurricane and some of that resilience. But no, unfortunately, I'm not privy to any specific case studies. Or Tyndall Air Force Base. Tyndall.
We had a webcast several weeks ago. It was on August 20th, and it was called Planning for the U.S. Military and U.S. Government, Challenges and Opportunities. Some of the panelists that we had on the line might very well know the answer to that question. So if anyone is interested in that, I urge you to take a look at that webcast and check out the panelists and maybe reach out to them. Okay, next question.
I could see what I can find for next week too, because I know there's been some wildfires impacting bases in California.
Thank you.
Do you like all my plugs for next week?
Right, very good, thank you. Let's see here.
I'm going to suggest
Jim.
planners take a look at and maybe contact Norfolk, Virginia, because that is a big naval base there, and I know that there's been an awful lot of work there because of sea level rise and nuisance flooding and so on. And in fact, George Homewood, the planning director there, probably could tell you more.
Wonderful, thank you. Edith, this one's for you. How do you manage the need for increasing housing production with building safely in hazardous or risky areas?
Yeah. So one thing, I know this is especially acute in California, but I know that this is a problem largely across the United States, is putting in affordable housing and increasing our housing supply generally throughout the United States. And one of the issues we run up in, and Chad, I don't know if you've seen this as well, is a lot of people, there's a supposedly easy solution to completely prohibit building in a risky area or in a hazardous area. But when you have a community and perhaps that hazardous area is the only place that you actually have left to grow, or there's another reason why building into that area would be beneficial for your community, you kind of don't really have the option of prohibiting construction there. But what you can do is contemplate ways to build that community or whatever it is in some way that mitigates those risks and that drops that level of risk down to a reasonable level. And that might require taking your local community, looking at your requirements, looking at any state or regional requirements for building with that hazard and increasing them, which is not always something that's popular to do, to put more restrictions on the development. But if it means that the development can happen where it otherwise wouldn't be able to, that's something that's worth looking into. So there are ways that you can balance the need for increasing our housing production and the need to keep people safe from an unreasonable risk of a flood or a fire hazard. It takes a lot more creativity. It takes perhaps going out on a limb and putting more requirements on that development to make it safer than perhaps a development that's not in a riskier or a hazardous area. But it can be done, and there are tools out there to help you do that.
Yeah, and not related to that question, but I was wondering if I could go back to the previous one in terms of the military, because it struck something I remembered that I think is just fantastic, and I hope that it expands. Over the last, I think, actually since 2009, but it's really gotten a lot of publicity, I think, the last couple years, up in Newtok, Alaska. There is a native village that is being relocated in its entirety due to coastal erosion threats and those kinds of things. But one of the key providers of assistance is the Department of Defense, and it is through the Innovative Readiness Training, IRT program. And it provides military personnel with real-world training opportunities on projects that can benefit civilian communities. I'd begun poking around a little bit to seeing if this is even something available anywhere else in the country, because it's my understanding that IRT could help maybe communities that are disadvantaged, maybe low income, and again, just let your juices flow in terms of how many other communities might be out there that way. So it's not necessarily on a military base, but this is one of those innovative ways that I've heard where the Department of Defense could actually be helpful.
Thank you. And I'm trying to look right now. Maybe I found it. We actually had a webcast, and I believe it talked about that that move of that community. And I want to say it was last year, maybe. Yeah, I'll keep looking. I'll see if I can find it. It was a super fascinating webcast about how they were literally moving communities out of the way of hazards. It was super fascinating. Okay, I'll see if I can find it, and I'll mention it when I do. This question: what role do community mitigation plans play when it comes to infrastructure and extreme weather trends?
Yes, so I would say two primary roles. One of those is that a community mitigation plan has a section that really analyzes hazards, and in a way, what the plan is capable of doing is kind of being that encyclopedia of and that history of hazard events in the community for all the major hazards it faces. What I find a well done mitigation plan will have record of these large hazard events, let's say a flood event, and whether it's pictures, data, high water marks, all those kinds of things, potential damages, it at least gives a sense of what that hazard is and the magnitude of that hazard in the community. But then I think the other is in the mitigation actions piece. And this is where I think from a national perspective, mitigation plans have the greatest area to improve. I think we've come a long ways in terms of doing risk assessments and assessing the built environment to find out what the risk is, but it's on the mitigation actions. And so, we need to have a lot more plans, I think, that say, hey, look, I have a piece of infrastructure. It's the wastewater treatment plant of my small community. And if it gets hit, people are in real trouble for weeks. and have that turned into a mitigation action that folks can improve its resiliency overall. And that goes with really any other piece of infrastructure.
Great, thank you. And I did find that webcast just now. Guess what? It was this year. I have no time. I have no sense of time, apparently. It was put on by the Housing and Community Development Division. The original air date, it looks like, was January 29th, and the title is Resilience in Vulnerable Communities When Climate Change Forces Relocation. And it was the first of a two-part series that was exploring these vulnerable communities and how they kind of are interacting with climate change right now. And the first one, it was someone from the state of Alaska, and then the other one, I think it was somewhere in Louisiana. I don't remember. It was like in a marsh type area. Anyway, check it out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/planningwebcast. You can check all those out.
Actually, it's Ile de Jean Charles community.
That's right. That's right. It was. So you remember that. You listened in on that one?
I just knew it.
Oh, you just knew it. Okay. Well, there you go. Perfect. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up because it's showing as 2:15 on my end. Wow, this was a great discussion, and we have so many questions left unanswered. So folks, this is your cue to join us for the next part of this, which is September 23rd. Again, fire and water, extreme weather trends, community infrastructure, and this one we're calling it the Practitioners Roundtable. So it's more of an intermediate level kind of perspective of this. So we look forward to seeing everyone again for this next round. And we are recording this, as I mentioned before. It will be available sometime tomorrow on our YouTube channel, and we'll also have a PDF of the slide deck available on our website. Head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to download the PDFs, to get links to the videos, and there you can also register for all of our upcoming sessions, including part 2 of this, which is September 23rd. And we also have a webcast coming up on Friday too, and that one is called the 15-minute city, our past and our future. So that will be kind of interesting to talk about that. So thanks to my panelists and for everyone who put this together. We appreciate you and your time. And everyone have a great week, and we'll talk next time. Thanks, everybody.
I know.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.